So in 1996, the U.S. Department of Justice analyzed the first 28 cases that were overturned by DNA evidence. They've reported that 24 out of the 28 cases involved mistaken eyewitness testimony, some with multiple eyewitnesses. And a recent study by Barry Scheck in 2000 reported that mistaken eyewitness identification in 84% of cases that were overturned by DNA evidence. So this is an astounding number. With DNA evidence, we have this unique opportunity to go back and reanalyze evidence in cases. I mean, this DNA analysis is relatively new. And we have that, when we have that opportunity and the cases are actually turned over, overwhelmingly, mistaken eyewitness identification was a factor in the wrongful conviction. Confidence in witnesses. Jurors overestimate the validity of eyewitness testimony because most people are not aware of the factors that can compromise eyewitness accuracy. Just like you probably weren't before we started this lecture, or hopefully you read the textbook. Another study by Elizabeth Loftus. I love this study. I think this is so fascinating. So she took mock jurors and they were presented with a case of armed robbery that resulted in 2 deaths. So these mock jurors were presented with evidence in the case. 18% of the mock jurors who only heard circumstantial evidence convicted the defendant. So they just heard circumstantial evidence about the defendant being involved in the crime. No physical evidence. Now, when the mock jurors heard eyewitness testimony, in addition to circumstantial evidence, the conviction rate jumped up from 18% to 72%. Now, this is the fascinating part. When the jurors were presented with eyewitness testimony from an eyewitness that had 2400 vision, 2400 vision would mean that at 20 feet, you can see what a normal person can see at 400 feet. Guess what that is? That's legally blind. Even when the eyewitness was legally blind, 68% of the jurors that were presented with that eyewitness testimony still found the defendant guilty. So, mistaken eyewitness identifications are the leading factor in wrongful convictions. Wrongful convictions occur. Mistaken eyewitness identification contributes to over 75% of the more than 200 wrongful convictions in the United States overturned by post-DNA analysis, post-conviction DNA analysis. There have been 221, last semester at this time it was only 215, post-conviction DNA exonerations in the United States. I mean, that's not a ton, but it's still a lot of individuals, saying 215 individuals that were wrongly incarcerated for crimes that they didn't commit. And these stories are becoming more and more familiar as innocent people gain their freedom through post-conviction DNA analysis. And with the DNA analysis done, an interesting thing is that the true suspects or perpetrators have actually been identified in 82% or 82 of the exonerated cases. One more thing that I want to address. So in this lecture, we've talked about eyewitness identification. The number 2 factor of wrongful conviction is If you had to guess, false confessions. Confessions, not confections. And right up on the list behind that is likely informants or snitches. So in more than 15% of cases of wrongful conviction overturned by DNA analysis, an informant or a jailhouse snitch testified against the defendant. And sometimes when people have incentives to testify, like an informant, not always are those incentives disclosed to the jury. So sometimes the central piece of evidence that's involved in convicting a person. So stop snitching. Actually, you should snitch if you are a witness in a crime, but that's not really what snitching is to me. So think about that a little bit more. The Innocence Project is headed up by Barry Scheck, and the Innocence Project seeks to understand the causes of wrongful conviction. Go to their website, it's innocenceproject.org. It's a fascinating website. But when they look at the causes of wrongful conviction, they have identified some of the leading causes as eyewitness misidentification, unreliable, limited science, false confessions, forensic science misconduct, government misconduct, informants, snitches, and bad lawyering. If we look at the race of those individuals that have been exonerated, overwhelmingly they're black. So out of the first 200, 120 were black, 55 white. I'm trying to think. Okay. If we look at the crimes that people have been committed for, and then have been exonerated, these are seriously violent crimes: rape, assault, robbery, murder, and sexual assault. So you're going to be doing a lot of prison time for those. So how does the wrong person get picked? Well, we've talked about cognitive errors, right? Sometimes the mistakes are triggered by a gap in memory, or maybe a desire to make an identification. In other cases, maybe a police officer will give a subtle cue as to who the suspect is. Almost all of the cognitive errors are preventable. Now, procedural errors, police use the same procedures that they have used for decades and decades and decades for identification purposes. And that's a live lineup or a photo spread or a photo lineup or a mug book. Usually these are conducted by an investigating officer that knows who the suspect is and has worked a case. And it's really a stressful process. Imagine if you've just been the victim of a crime and now you have to identify the perpetrator. People make mistakes. These are preventable as well, though.